Ursprünglich war sie in West- und Südwestafrika heimisch, die Ölpalme. Niederländer haben sie auf die indonesische Insel Java gebracht, Briten dann später nach Malaysia. Und das Palmöl ist ein Verkaufsschlager. Wir haben es alle bestimmt schon mal gegessen in Brot, Schokolade, Eis oder Keksen. Problem: Die Plantagen haben ein industrielles Ausmaß, nehmen weltweit viele Millionen Hektar ein und mehr als 100 Arten sind deshalb bedroht. Schimpansen in Nigeria beispielsweise oder Tiger in Thailand. Wir hören jetzt gleich beim Forum Ernährung, Handel und Sicherheit, welche Auswirkungen die aktuellen geopolitischen und klimatischen Risiken auf die Ernährungssicherheit der Bevölkerung in Nahost- und Nordafrika haben und welche Folgen Energie- und Ernährungskrisen für schon bestehende Spannungen haben. Lena Dallywater vom Leibniz Institut für Länderkunde der Universität Leipzig. Sie übernehmen jetzt an dieser Stelle und ich wünsche uns allen viele gute Erkenntnisse.
Vielen Dank für die nette Einleitung. Kann man mich gut hören? Wir werden jetzt gleich ins Englische wechseln, also alle, die gerne auf Deutsch folgen möchten. Ich glaube, es gibt hier einen Übersetzer im Raum und es gibt auch kleine Kopfhörer, die Sie sich ausleihen können. Also I would like to start now in English because actually our two guests will be speaking English and will be presenting their inputs in English. We're very happy to be here. Many thanks to the festival organizers. It's day 3 of a fantastic event and we're extremely glad to have two wonderful guests here. We have one guest here on site, Gilad Ben-Nun, and one guest will join us online, that is Sara. Sara, can you hear as well? Welcome. So I'm Lena Dallywater. I'm working here in Leipzig and I will be briefly introducing our two guests. As I said, they will give two inputs each on their view of the nexus of food, trade and security. And first of all, I welcome Sara. Sara Ashour is a trade policy analyst and negotiator at the Egyptian Ministry of Trade and Industry with more than 12 years of experience in development, trade agreements, rules of origin, and trade facilitation. Furthermore, through working within various developmental organizations and her experience within the International Labour Organization, she developed significant experience on development issues, specifically children's rights, health rights, and gender issues. Besides currently being a PhD fellow within the Regional Center for Sustainable Adaptation to Global Change in the Middle East, she holds an MA in Development and Governance from University Duisburg-Essen in Germany and a BA in Political Science from Kairo University, which also means she does understand some German, so if you want to ask questions later in German, that would be possible too. Within the course of her PhD, she focuses on topics of agricultural trade policies, food security and climate mitigation efforts within the Jordan River Basin. Welcome, Sara, again to you. To my right, we have Dr. Gilad Ben-Nun. He is a lead researcher for the 2.9 million euro EU Horizon 2020 PREVEX project at Leipzig University, and he holds the Alfred Grosser Chair Professorship at Sciences Po Paris. He has served as the guest professor for Israel Studies at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, was Ford Foundation Senior Research at the UN in Geneva, and EU Marie Curie Fellow at Verona University's Law Faculty. He holds a PhD and habilitation from Leipzig University, but today we will begin with Sara first. I believe, Sara, you have prepared a few slides for us, and I would like to invite you to say hi to the audience and to share your slides.
So let me say good evening, everyone, for all the audience in the festival. It is my pleasure to be here today. And thank you, Lena, for the wonderful presentation. I think I would first begin by saying that in the Middle East, we always say that we use the term of having bread and salt, عيش وملح, between the people who actually have a good relationship if you have a good relationship with someone, you say you have عيش وملح, which is bread and salt, which gives a lot of indications about how bread is very important in the culture here in the Middle East. So not to be long in the presentation and going into the presentation that I'm going to say today, I'm actually looking at trade and food security nexus, whether the MENA region is ready for upcoming climate or geopolitical risks. First, setting everything straight, what do we mean by food security? In basic terms, the FAO defines food security by 4 basic terms: availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability. If these 4 concepts are present within a certain context, then we can say that food security is there. Of course, we can see very much how climate change have amplified the scarcity of natural resources in the region and altered growing conditions, increasing risks for different plants and animal diseases. As the UN Secretary General say, if we do not feed people, we feed conflict. And that is something very important and highlights why food security is important in the region. So according to latest UN calculations in 2020, we see that one of the highest insecure continents with regards to food is Africa on top, and then we come to the Middle East as a second place. And also the FAO highlights that 11 out of 13 MENA region countries with available data have cereal import dependency. They import it extensively from abroad, with percentages ranging from 50% to 100% in some cases like Jordan and the UAE. If we look further at statistics from the FAO as well, we see how there is huge dependency for food supplies, whether it's wheat, meat, cereals, sugar, fruit and vegetables. Even though the region has very well known for growing different agricultural projects, but still dependency with regards to cereals and wheat products is very much dominant. And probably we see that this import dependency will still be there. Projections by OECD and FAO show very much the projections that dependency will remain to be there until 2030 and maybe afterwards. The Ukraine crisis of course, have highlighted such dependency, have showed us how the continent is very much dependent on the wheat and cereals imported from Ukraine and Russia. But prior to that, we've also suffered from COVID protectionist measures put by some agricultural exporting countries. And this actually shows us at the end how this limited production potentials implies higher import dependency continuing and even aggravating with other risks, whether COVID or something else. So just to cut it short, how can trade help? As a trade policy analyst and I like trade so much, so I see a lot of potential there. I see that trade can play a key role in food security. How can this be done? I think that diversifying sources of import is a very important lesson learned from the risks we've been seeing along the past few years. It would reduce vulnerability, and in this regard, we cannot think of self-sufficiency. That is not a solution. We rather have to think of maybe regional approach or probably a regional approach. Many Arab countries now have suggested something, an idea called food facility project, which is like regional silos that you can use for storing different grains. That idea came actually after the Ukraine crisis, and several African countries were hit by that. Some other measures dealing with non-tariff measures, such as sanitary and phytosanitary measures or tender specifications, is very important to reduce the implication of depending so much on cereal imports. Most of the cereals are imported according to tender specifications in the MENA region, and most regularly they are not transparent or not quite complicated. So dealing with that would help a lot. Promoting trade facilitation is very important. Some statistics indicate that increasing facilitation could reduce the cost of trading perishable goods by 18%. there's also this argument of friendshoring, you know, the role of, you know, similar regimes depending on each other. So in the times of crisis, we do not fall in problems. So there's some countries now that try to depend more on their allies to avoid the problem of falling in food crises in times of crisis. In our case in Egypt, we've done this in some times. Like now, we are trying to build more with India, with some countries in Latin America, diversifying its hand, diversifying sources, but also on another hand as a kind of friendshoring. Also, one last thing is increasing and diversifying production using sustainable production practices, resorting to more creative and innovative ways in agricultural sustainability. I can give an example. For example, the last few years, there's this planting quinoa has been very popular in Egypt due to its adaptability to extreme climate conditions. And it could be actually substituted with other wheat byproducts. So that is in a key, my vision on that topic. But here, I'm not here only to display my vision. I would also like to learn from the perspectives of people who are attending. And this is why I would like to finalize my presentation with two questions. Do you actually feel the link between trade policies and your daily food choices? Another thing is, do you agree that trade can play a role in food security? I would really, when we come to the discussion part, would like to know the reflections of the audience on these questions. That's it for me now here.
Thank you very much, Sara, for this food for thought, literally, and a good question. Me personally, when I choose my daily food, it depends on my appetite and what is on special offer in the supermarket. Gilad, what would you say? Do you feel the link between trade policies and your daily food choices?
Well, I think that in terms of the trade policies themselves, when we look at the relative rise of cost of food, and everybody feels it when we go to the supermarket, it's interesting to compare the fact that we here in Europe, we import most of our vegetables, for example, from Spain or from Portugal, but within the European Union, or with trade partners who have no tariffs, tomatoes from Morocco or blueberries from Egypt, we are relatively more immune to the hike in prices. We've suffered the hike in prices that we feel in our pocket of 20–25%. Compare that to people in the global south, people in Latin America or Indonesia, who feel a rise of 60% in the price, for example, of rice in their own quarters. The reason for us suffering 25 and they suffering 60 is because we have a very wide, relatively wide, free tariff zone for the EU and its partners. Were we to enlarge that further, we would probably both benefit people in Morocco, but also benefit our pockets ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Gilad. I think we will come back to that economic factor later on. But first of all, I would like to invite you to give your input. I think, Gilad, you also have prepared a PowerPoint.
Basically, I'm going to discuss as we get to the PowerPoint when it comes up. Oh. This is mainly stuff which is coming out of this 3-year, €2.9 million SC6, which is a funding line in the EU which does top-down research, not bottom-up research, that is to say research which the EU needs, commissions, and then usually rather large consortia bid for it and win. We in Leipzig were one of the consortium that won the Prevex call of €2.9 million. We were looking at questions of extremism originally. So we were not looking at questions of food. And we came round to the questions of food and how its availability or non-availability triggers, fuels the question of more violent extremism or less through the question of governance. These are two of the papers. If you do Prevex on the web, you'll see all the papers and publications freely downloadable. And one of the most interesting understandings that we came out with after, this is basically our 3rd year, with a rather wide cross-cutting research on 14 Arab countries and the Balkans, in fact, was that governance matters. And governance matters crucially, generally for extremism and specifically for food security. What you have here is a list of countries and their GDP per capita in what we call the 10 years of the Arab Spring, that is to say roughly 2011 to 2021. And what you will see is, and I could have given you the list of all the members of the League of Arab States, and you would have seen that virtually all countries, all Arab countries, with the exception of two, which are Jordan and Morocco, and now Egypt only now, their GDP per capita today is fundamentally lower than what it was a day before the Arab Spring. That is to say, in 2011, a day before Tunisia broke out, and then Libya and Syria and Egypt and so on and so forth, and Yemen, people in the region...
Recording in progress.
That's good. People in the region were fundamentally better off and able to fund their food needs. The question, of course, is why? Why is it that this Arab Spring did not bring the kind of change in governance we would have wanted to, or that people in the region would have wanted to see? And what has that got to do with food security? And the answer has to do with a very simple fact that in places where poverty is fundamental, where many people live beneath the poverty line of the World Bank, which is $2 a day for people who don't know it, people prefer, first of all, to eat. And only then do they have, quote unquote, the luxury of thinking of democracy or such thoughts. One of the most interesting graphs in this is the top left side, which is Egypt. And it is incredibly interesting to see that in Egypt today, there is a much wider support for the Sisi regime, which is pretty hard-handed, even if we compare to the Mubarak era, simply because there is more level of an accountability, especially in the cases now on food subsidies before Ramadan. As grain prices go higher, a sense of accountability of the regime to the people's needs. And this is true also of the two countries which do have a rise in GDP per capita, which were the Sharifi kingdoms, the kingdoms of Jordan and Morocco. And this has to do with a bigger trend on the questions of Jordan and Morocco, where the food security questions comes into a governance and investment into infrastructure, major infrastructure projects. And there again, the main token is this question of, is there trust and belief between the public and the regime? The more there is, the regime can go for long-term development of infrastructural projects. Egypt has now basically copied the model of Morocco, which was one of the highest in the world in that investment, and Jordan. It's building a new capital that you can see the pictures of. And the last point is that this type of trust also influences a rise in human rights. You see the Economist Democracy Index on the left, and you will see very interestingly that the same rise in GDP per capita of Morocco along the Arab Spring has also given a rise for that country in the Democracy Index from what it used to be, which is a rather vile authoritarian regime, almost to the level of a flawed democracy, which is rather astounding given the fact that this was done during the Arab Spring. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Many thanks, Gilad, to you for making this connection between governance and food security. I'm aware that there are many guests here more locally from Saxony and also from a non-academic audience. So therefore, I would like to ask you, Sara, and you, Gilad, if we now return to the basics of this discussion. There are many statistics, there are definitions, regulations, but food security in simple terms, for our audience, what does it mean to you and what does it entail generally? Perhaps, Sara, you begin with what you would define or understand as food security in most general terms.
Probably I would just reflect on the definition of FAO, and also not only the definition, but what we've seen here after the Ukraine crisis as a layman and going to the street buying my own bread. So FAO was saying food security is availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability. In the case of bread, it was not fully available. It was not fully accessible. We could not further utilize it in a way. And the flow was not there. We were all in a very insecure condition whether we would find more shipments coming or not. So in a very nutshell, I think the definition of FAO puts it in a very simple way in 4 basic concepts.
And if you could repeat again, FAO, what is that?
It's the United, putting it in much simpler terms, it's the United Nations organization that's affiliated with agricultural commodities and issues of agricultural commodities, putting it in a very, very simple way for the...
Thank you, Sara. And Gilad, do you have anything to add to that very clear definition?
I mean, we felt it. I remember going at the beginning at some stage with this grain crisis somewhere in March or April, and you went into the supermarket. I live in Frankfurt. You went into the supermarket and there was a clear sign where you were allowed to take only 1 kilogram of flour and 1 bottle of cooking oil for a certain period. And suddenly people were astounded by the fact that, you know, there might just be a condition where there is a certain amount of rationing, something which, by the way, in UK supermarkets is happening on a daily basis now, as far as I hear. I think the issue of food security, again, and I'm going here to governance, is the question of its management. That is to say, can you manage the flow of food sufficiently to people with a sufficient price, and when need be, have active governmental intervention on putting a price cap so that at the most basic needs everybody can eat. And that's a pretty old, you know, Roman term. Let's have bread and circus shows in that sense, or we will have riots in Rome.
When there was no pasta anymore in the supermarket. But for the area you are researching, Gilad, to continue, what is your prognosis for the next 5 years then for this constellation, food, trade, security? What can we expect for the region that you have in view, and what could be potential measures also to counter the crises that you have sketched out?
I think we need to think of it, first of all, we need to think of it regionally, but we also need to think of it country-wise, because the changes between countries are radical. That is to say, the level of food insecurity in Libya today, which is no longer 1 country, it's actually 3 countries, is fundamentally, the challenges there are exponentially higher than Morocco or its neighbor Tunisia. Not that Tunisia, I mean, there is, within the next 5 years, what we will see is that the relatively secure and rich will be better and doing better off, and the poorer will be doing much worse. And that dichotomy is only going to increase, I'm afraid. From a regional perspective, it is pretty obvious that the people, the countries that can be associated to Europe via free trade agreements and so on, I'm speaking specifically of countries like Morocco, Egypt has it, Tunisia has it, and so on, will benefit greatly. Because the minute the EU, so long as the EU is solving its own food issues, whether it's stopping to import from Ukraine but importing from the Midwest grain, then that then trickles down to the ability to help those countries. So I do think it's a country optic. And then again, in the next 5 years, the less governance we have, the more chaotic it's going to get, and the more governance we have, even if it's governance we don't always, from a Western European perspective, like to see, whether it's autocratic regimes or others and so on, we should be in a sort of a Kissingerian mode of considering the alternatives of total chaos. And as I said today, one of the worst 2 examples are actually Yemen and Libya, where no governance really becomes the worst case scenario.
Sara, would you agree on such a 5-year prognosis, or what is your experience from the Egyptian example? What would you see for the future?
Honestly, I would say that maybe I don't want to be pessimistic. You know, I would say first that it's probably hard to predict how it's going with all the crises we've been seeing the last few years that we did not expect. But I would agree with Gilad on the terms of governance importance. And maybe on this regard, I would go on several levels. First, the level of countries and how they should actually cooperate in finding a way that to cooperate in this regard. As I said in my presentation, regional ideas are very much important to secure the flow of food, but also finding new partners and not only depending on old partners. But also there's a very important thing that I want to highlight as well, which is also relevant to what Gilad was saying in countries and which witnesses crises, severe war crises. We've all seen the professionals in trade have for a very long time lost belief in the World Trade Organization and its role in doing something really beneficial in trade in the world. But the last ministerial meeting, we witnessed something which we considered as a breakthrough, which is the decision the decision in a very simple terms. We can say that countries agreed to offer organizations such as the WHO, the WFP, and the countries who are the organizations that are responsible for food purchases in countries of crisis. They offer them the assurance that they can buy food for such areas without the restrictions or the limitations we see, like the ones we see in the Ukraine crisis. So that is one of the decisions that actually make me feel a little bit optimistic. Maybe sometimes it's not the best condition that we wish to. All of us would wish that the people in crisis are better off than they are now, but at least it's a pity that we have a big organization such as the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and it's not being able to privilege even the people who are suffering from war. So as I said, finding a common way in governance, as Gilad said, is very important on regional level, but also on a multilateral level. That would be very much important.
Yeah, thank you, Sara, for your answer and also for some optimism in this regard. And with this optimism in mind, I will have a look in the audience. And I wonder if there are any questions to our guest speakers in German or in English we can facilitate or translate.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I'd like to know maybe your stance or views on more, because I know this is about trade, but maybe your views on localized movements and alternative food networks and how they could maybe help with food insecurity. Excuse me. And then also maybe look at or discuss the possibility of, I know this sounds extreme, but like rations in more especially privileged societies and how that might be able to increase like fair trade. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Sara, do you have a spontaneous answer regarding local initiatives, rationing, fair trade, so more on a base level?
I'm 100% that this is important. It's a part of the governance on the grassroots level. But if you're asking on a specific example, I don't have something in mind in the Middle East for now, but I know that there is, with the COP27 being scheduled in Egypt, COP27 is one of the UN climate conferences, the most important climate conferences that's being held. It's being held this year in Egypt at the end of this year. And there's a lot of push from the government for several actors in the society to have a role in this regard, whether it's the small NGOs or persons. Even there's much look on innovative ways to finance such movements or such groups. I don't know if I understood your question correctly, but maybe if you can clarify more, I can be able to answer as well.
I think I guess it is difficult because, yeah, it's the Middle East is a different sort of scenario because it's not like there's an abundance of like variety of food, or I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. But I guess I was referring more to just like the world in general, and how like alternative food networks that focus on specifically like localized systems, like so basically the opposite of trade, like trying to keep things local and just like looking at that. But yeah, obviously it's not as applicable in places maybe like the Middle East. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, so I just thought that could be like a nice thing to throw into the discussion, like look at things that are maybe not so trade focused. I know this is about trade, but just also looking at the opposite. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, like maybe I would add here that no, there's an abundance of agricultural products in Middle East, and maybe going back to trade, there's several. If you look at the exports, they're one of the top exports are the agricultural products. But going back to what you're saying is being partially independent or self-sufficient, if this is what you mean. Right, I mean, there's a lot of countries in the Middle East after the Ukraine crisis have begun thinking in this manner, not trying to be dependent on trade in any way. But we also, during COVID, what did this type of thinking led us to, especially with the medical supplies, overflow between the countries. Everyone thought I should keep that to my country, to myself, and there was a crisis, a big crisis, a humanitarian crisis in several countries, especially in Africa. So this is why now there's several MENA-Region countries who cannot depend on that argument. Now, they do not have the luxury for that because, several reasons, but also it has opened, for Egypt, for example, we do not plant wheat because of climate conditions, obviously, but also because water scarcity conditions. So sometimes you don't have the luxury to be self-sufficient in some commodities, especially when we talk about wheat, because the climate is not okay, but you can still depend on other partners, such as African partners, which we have free trade agreements with them, which you can bring these commodities free of taxes. But in the country itself, agriculturally, we have this luxury. We have most of the agricultural product all year long because the climate supports that. But for some commodities, it's not possible, especially grains and wheat. It consumes a lot of water. Even rice consumes a lot of water, which is the opportunity cost of doing it here in the country is not applicable, maybe. I don't know if that answers your question.
Gilad, do you have anything to add? You mentioned rationing earlier on, and perhaps from your research, what is your experience?
I found the question, generally the question of non-governmental initiative or grassroots initiative or bottom-up approaches, call it whatever, any one of those terms. They're actually much more successful than we think, at least historically, when we look at them. And specifically in the Middle East, the most famous example, which to this day works, is something which is called the Johnston Committee, which is the sharing of the waters of the Jordan River, which come down from the north, from Syria and Lebanon, between the countries which are downriver, that is to say, between Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan, in an area which is extremely arid. Not to mention the fact that Jordan is now hosting over 1 million Syrian refugees to a population of about 4 million who still need to drink. That initiative, which began in 1952, was a purely bottom-up NGO, Harvard/Quaker/ all kinds of private organizations who actually came and did it, and then at some stage governments actually adopted a plan which was done by them. And that is pretty much, and these are warring countries who have a ceasefire agreement, nothing more, no peace between Syria and Israel or Lebanon, and still that works. So I must say that I'm a rather big believer in those types of approaches. One caveat is that if you are going for such approaches, they usually succeed best when the bottom-up players are from more than one country. So if you can get NGOs, religious organizations, even individuals, universities, whatever you want, between the countries themselves to get up to an agenda, that usually, and we know that from Africa in different areas, we know it from Latin America, that's a very productive way to do it. But it needs willpower from people, and it needs some sort of thinking of coordination by these non-governmental actors.
Yeah, thank you, Gilad. I need to look at the watch for a moment, and I also see parts of the audience starting to eat with all this food talk. So I would say perhaps we have one final question from the audience. Well, if not, then I would have one final question, and I wonder what is your opinion, Gilad? Those people listening to us outside on Augustusplatz, what is your opinion? Will they have difficulties affording their pizza margherita outside in the future, or do you think it will balance back out?
I think that, you know, we're sitting here in a country with a GDP per capita of $48,000 or $46,000, something like that. I mean, I don't think that here we would have a serious problem eating a pizza margherita. I think the bigger problem is the question, the extent to which we care, are involved, are cognizant of what is happening to the majority of a planet of 8 billion, of which at least 4 to 5 billion do have a problem, in comparison to, say, 300 or 400 million Europeans, who are approximately 5% of the planet, who might have less of a problem. So the question for me is less one, will they afford their hamburger or their pizza? What is the degree of care that they have outside of their own little world? I would say that, and if we could increase that, my feeling is that, and then they pressure their governments, the World Food Program, WFP, and a multitude of other organizations, then we're looking better. I would say that would be for me the main concern.
Well, yeah, I would hope that we have raised some awareness for the topic, at least also with this session today. Sara, would you like to share a final word from your side?
Maybe just to add on what Gilad said, I think it's very important for us citizens to pressure our governments in a way to be safe better than sorry, because with all the crises we've been seeing, it's not good to stand and be a reaction to what's happening. It's very much important to have innovative approaches towards especially the basics like food security for our populations. And I think that is very important for us to hold our governments responsible too. That is very important.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sara. Thank you, Gilad. Thanks to the audience of today here in the room and also online. I need to have a look at our general moderator, and I will hand back over to her. If you have any further questions, I'm sure that both Sara and Gilad will be happy to receive emails after this event. But thanks to you for now, and hope to see you in the next event, which our moderator will introduce soon. Thank you.